Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, all these folks who have workers' blood on their hands, all their billions of dollars I don't care about, all these folks that have workers' bloods on their hands, they will be held accountable.
Today is Wednesday, February 2nd. The year is 2022. This is No Easy Answers, and I am your host, Jules Taylor. Today, like all days, I have no easy answers for you. Well, thank you for tuning in from wherever in the world you happen to be listening. My name is Jules Taylor, this is No Easy Answers, and I am delighted to have you with us for today's episode. No Easy Answers is a podcast about politics, philosophy, and the human condition, and today we have the esteemed Kooper Caraway joining us for a conversation about his life, organized labor, activism, and the working class. Now, for those of you not familiar with Kooper, you are definitely in for a treat today. As you'll hear in our conversation, Kooper was elected president of the South Dakota Federation of Labor when he was but 29 years old. And that makes him the youngest state labor federation president in the country. And you might already be familiar with Kooper if you follow the work that we do over at the Working People podcast, or if you follow the Valley Labor Report. Maybe you've even seen him on CNN. I mean, I really enjoyed learning more about Kooper and learning more about his life and the work that he does. I'm a big fan of his work, as you'll hear. And I hope that you will enjoy this conversation too. And thank you to all of you listening and supporting the podcast. Thank you to all of our paid subscribers on Patreon who make this show possible. Please consider tossing a couple bucks towards the show. And in exchange, you do receive some bonus content, including some of our interviews and episodes in advance. That's at patreon.com/noeasyanswers. And thank you for leaving 5-star reviews inside Apple Podcasts and Audible. That helps bring new listeners over to the show. And so taking a moment to leave a review helps us expand our reach. And so here is my conversation with Kooper Caraway. All right, so Coop, thanks for hanging out with us today. Welcome to No Easy Answers. And I am familiar with some of your stuff already, man, via Working People. Listeners of No Easy Answers may be aware that I work in my capacity as a producer for Working People, which is republished by In These Times Magazine and the Real News Network. And, Max has had some really wonderful and inspirational interviews with you in the past. And so I'm very excited to sit down and talk with you today. How you doing, Kooper?
I'm doing great, brother. Happy to be on, happy to support the pod. Big fan of anything that you or Max does.
Awesome. Very cool. And we are big fans of you, brother. So, this interview I wanted to ask you about, because you're a little enigmatic to me, because I wonder, like, how did someone at your age get to, prioritize labor, the labor movement, and the working class to such a degree that you are the youngest, you can tell me your title is President of the Federation of Labor. Is that accurate?
That's right.
Yeah. I mean, are you still under 30? Are you like 29 still or 31?
I'm 31. Yeah. So I was elected when I was elected when I was 29. And I just recently turned 31 at the end of October. And so, yeah, I'm still by a number of years, more than a decade, still the youngest state Fed president in the country.
Right. So I want to ask you about your life, man, starting out with your family life as a child, and maybe you can tell us about how labor and labor organizing came to be at the forefront of your life by way of your earliest days in Texas.
Yeah, sure. So I was actually born in Alabama. My family, most of my family came from Texas, but they had, just moved from Texas to Alabama, where I was born. A small area in northern Alabama. My family's working class family, right? And so when you have a working class family, a lot of times you move around a lot. And so we moved, from place to place. Ended up leaving that small town after a few years and moving to Birmingham, bigger city, and lived there for a few years, relocated, jobs dried up. We had to relocate to South Carolina. Jobs dried up. We went back to Alabama. Same thing happens again, moved back to South Carolina. I went to, 5 different middle schools, 4 or 5 different high schools throughout my childhood, and then ended up in Texas when I was in high school, sophomore in high school, and I stayed there for a long time, into my mid-20s, but yeah, just traveling through the South, working class family, living paycheck to paycheck, and the interesting thing about a lot of working folks will tell you that they experience radically different conditions in the span of their life, right, or in the span of their childhoods, right. So most working people, can talk to you about a time where they felt pretty secure, in the conditions, felt like, okay, I live in a kind of a nice place, and I have, the things I want, and there's presents under the tree at Christmas and stuff like that. But a lot of times those same people can tell you, about a time where things were abysmal, and hopeless, and I'm no exception to that. Right. So, there were definitely times where we were doing a little bit better, and didn't really want anything, and had everything I needed, and stuff like that. And then there were times where we were, me and my mother and my sister were homeless, living out of a car, for days, or sleeping on friends, had relying on family friends to take us in, or times where we had a place to live, but I had to, in the middle of the night, jump my neighbor's fence and sneak over to their water faucet to fill up empty milk jugs so that I had water to take a shower in the morning. And so these are radically different conditions that a lot of working folks experience throughout their livelihood, right? I mean, throughout their lifespan. And it was, being experiencing these different conditions that, led me, to my to a working class, and to a class, sort of analysis, right? So being in the South, you experience racism. Racism is right up front. My mother's indigenous, and my father is, second, third generation from Germany, white folks. But they tell the story, when they were first driving into Alabama, to the town we were moving into, Moulton. They were driving in, and there were Klansmen on the corner, of the square, just posted up around on each corner, just handing out flyers to the Klan meeting, right? And my father's job, there were Klansmen. The lunch room was segregated, and stuff like that. The black folks had to eat outside, and the white folks ate inside during lunch and stuff like that. And he was able to work to get that change, and get the lunch room integrated. But yeah, and so I think seeing just the objective fact that through my parents' work ethic and my family's effort and work ethic wasn't changing, but our conditions were radically changing, right? They were working as much as they could, and doing as much as they could, and being good workers, rarely taking off, and they were answering work calls, all the time, even when they weren't on the clock and stuff like that. But our conditions would radically change, and it seemed to, from my childhood view, it seemed to be on a whim, and so it didn't seem to me to matter how hard my parents were working or not. They could put the same amount of effort, and we could be doing well, but they could be putting that same amount of effort, and we could not have running water. And so it seemed to me like something was up from an early age. So I started exploring different remedies for that, and that's what brought me to working class and labor organizing. And I started down that path at a very, very young age.
Yeah, it's incredible, man. I talk to people about what's the best way to educate someone in terms of radical text. Where do you start, or what do you? And part of it is being a radical, that stuff comes out of oppression, comes out of poverty, comes out of lived experience. And I'm reminded of something that I believe Mao told his nephew or something, that was when you grow up, I hope that you're a liberal. And he's like, well, why would you hope that I'm a liberal? And he's like, well, you haven't suffered, so how would I expect you to become a leftist? So it's the most opportune time to sort of bring people into radical politics is, I kind of say it's like when you're sitting in the back of a patrol car next to them is the best time to say, hey, cops are bastards, or hey, doesn't the system, isn't it kind of shitty? But it's the lived experience of, going through poverty and oppression that, makes you take notice. I mean, maybe you're kind of forced to in a way, because you're like, either as a child, you're either going to look at your parents and think, oh, well, my parents are unlucky, or my parents don't work hard, or my parents. Then the other alternative is to look at the systems and understand that, like, no, these things are on a whim. Your parents' work ethic has not changed. The number of hours they're working have not changed. So at the end of the day, it's like, it's something that if you have that lived experience, it's easier to center labor and the working class and come about with these sort of class analysis results. But yeah, man, I mean, it sounds similar to like my childhood. I grew up in Texas as well. So, I mean, I didn't realize that you were born in Alabama and moved around. Like, my grandparents were migrant workers for a bit. And so there was a lot of moving based upon what was in season and stuff. And this is, my grandfather trying to work to become a teacher, trying to attend school while raising kids. At the end of the day, man, I mean, it's the life experience of a working class person that leads you towards the indictment of systems, because the other option is to blame individuals, and that is not an adequate class analysis, in my opinion, anyway. So,
yeah, you're absolutely right, and we're confronted, and sometimes, I admit that when I first started moving, in the direction that I moved, part of it was part of the choice was convenience. Part of the choice to move towards radicalism was out of convenience. And, it was, a lot of families, especially going through economic hardship, having difficulty feeding themselves, feeding their families, stuff like that. There's a lot of what feels like internal personal strife, right, within families, right, and that manifests itself in different levels and different layers and different levels of severity with different families. But it was definitely, for me, especially as a very young child with very little power in a system or in any dynamic that I was a part of, it was definitely more convenient for me to blame, to take my resentment and negative feelings and blame and place it on a system, right, and on the system, and choose, to forgive, my family and anyone else, in my life, my family, or if I had, encountered racist, teachers or folks who had made me feel bad, or landlords. It definitely was easier for me, to choose to forgive my friends, my family, the family friends, extended family, stuff like that, for anything that I'd done, and choose to blame a system. Putting all that blame on the individuals in my life definitely would have made my life a lot harder. It would have made my mental health a lot more troublesome, and things like that. And so there's also that, level of, that question of, it's just, sometimes it's just easier to go ahead and blame the system. And it's easier not out of any opportunistic reason or any Horatio Alger's bullshit, but it's easier because it's the truth, right? The easiest path is always to the truth. The easiest path is always through facts, right, and through the truth. But I'll say that I mean, you're right about the folks who experience oppression, poverty, exploitation, things like that, having a clearer path. But that doesn't forgive folks who don't necessarily experience those things from not standing on the side of the oppressed. Sure. There's heroic even examples of people who did grow up privileged, middle class, part of the ruling class families and things like that, who chose sides and chose the right side and chose to fight with us. Che Guevara, Fidel Castro. These folks, chose to do the right thing, right? And they weren't necessarily moved by direct exploitation that they face, but they were moved by the exploitation of their fellow men. I think that's a human reaction, and you don't get a pass for ignoring your natural human response to exploitation.
Sure. Yeah, man. I mean, I was reminded about this recent crazy stuff that happened with Wall Street and like GameStop, and how a lot of that was a response to the 2008 housing crisis. And some of those entries on the Reddit forums were heartbreaking and enraging, like simultaneously. Just like, had your if you have proletarian blood in you, it would make it boil in a way, because it was like, I remember seeing one of them said, do you know what tomato soup made out of condiments tastes like? Because my kids do, and that's what happened out of 2008, and that wasn't my fault. And so you see people, like, I just had this episode where I had to go on this sort of diatribe of like talking about how there's no greater con than the American dream, and about how we've all been given this sort of vision of a nice house, of money in a bank, of our children going to nice schools, of sort of prosperity that one could gain within this country. But yet time after time, we see that through no fault of the working class, they are stripped of these items that they've worked their entire lives for, i.e. the housing crisis. Things like, even with like the stock market falling now, people's retirements are in jeopardy. Even with it just seems like even now, like we're seeing like the stuff with the Amazon stuff, like with the tornado that just went through Kentucky in the last couple days. And there are these heartbreaking text messages that have come out of there where there's a guy, like, I believe he's telling his mother, like, yeah, Amazon's not letting us leave. And to me, like, I'm reminded of something that, like, when I spoke to Nate Holdrum, he had said, imagine the person that is irreplaceable to you. Imagine the person that means the world to you. And then imagine how they are going to predictably be treated by employers that, in some best case scenarios, see them purely as replaceable, and at worst, in a lot of ways, disposable. And perhaps that sort of intolerable tension of someone who is irreplaceable to you stacked up against these forces and societies and institutions that are willing to do great violence to them, and they're not treated as irreplaceable or that they mean the world to someone. And so, I look at everything that's going on within the labor movement today, within, calling employees essential, and then quickly moving to this mainstream, attitude of like, well, some people are just going to have to die for the economy. Like the way this sort of narrative is switched, the way that we have hypocritically held them up as essential when the entire time they knew that the stakes of poverty are death, that like poverty simply means that you are closer to death. And never before have these, in our society, have these truths been sort of unmasked and shown to be as true as they are. So I wonder, man, in terms of like your own upbringing, in terms of you seeing what the working class goes through and these sort of intolerable tensions, I wonder if you would say a few words on like some of your efforts in South Dakota to sort of tackle these issues head on in your work.
Yeah, let me first say that Jeff Bezos, these cronies that orchestrated the financial crisis, or these folks who are orchestrating these different recessions and things like that. Yes, rich folks, they like recessions. Trump said it. He's rich. Trump says a lot of stuff out loud that the rich folks usually don't say, but that they like recessions. That's the time to buy up and all this stuff while working folks are dying. Jeff Bezos literally murdering his workers in Kentucky and things like this. I'll say this, you can record it, you can put it down, you can hold me accountable to it. But Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, all these folks who have workers' blood on their hands, all their billions of dollars, I don't care about, all these folks that have workers' bloods on their hands, they will be held accountable. they will, in my lifetime, they will stand in a courtroom in front of a jury of the working class and a judge of the working class, and they will be held accountable for their actions. But we'll get to that point by whatever means we have to get to that point. But it will happen in my lifetime, and it will happen in your lifetime as well, Jules. But what you're describing, this disconnect between the public discussion of workers, essential workers, this and that, and the more private, or the more, also talking about dying for the economy, all this stuff. What this does is it exposes the radically different morals and values that exist between the ruling class and the working class. And while the working class is being led to believe that it's us, it's me and my fellow worker who have the radically different values between each other because of racial lines or how we vote or this or that. The reality is this: the working class has radically different values as a whole than the ruling class does. And the ruling class has not been able, in the 200 years that they've been in charge in this country, they have not been able to grasp some fundamental understandings of what life in a society is like, or what life is worth, right? They have no idea what the life of a single human being is worth, because they don't have a mechanism to measure it in dollars and cents, right? They do the best they can, but they don't have a mechanism to measure it in dollars and cents. So the best they can do is they can say to the media and say, okay, there's this virus that exists and it only kills so-and-so % of the people that it infects. And so by our formulaic calculation of risk assessment, it makes more sense to keep the economy going, and to keep our jobs going, than it does to close it down and to save these few people, right? Because it's not worth it. What working class people understand, though, is that the life of one human being is immeasurable, right? It really is.
Yes.
It really is. And if you lose one human being, right, some boss didn't just lose a worker who puts in 40 hours, right? Some boss didn't just lose a customer, who basically signs over half their damn paycheck to that store or whatever. That's not all that happened, right? The rest of us lost a neighbor, right? A neighbor who maybe was very helpful, particularly in weather emergencies or when in hard times or things like that. Especially we're looking at our elders, right? How we lost so many of our elders, and each person like over 60, over 70 that we lost is the equivalent. They're carrying around so much experience and so much knowledge and so many facts that every person over 70 that died from COVID is the equivalent of a library being burned down. Right, a library full of first editions that only one copy of that book exists, and it's a library full of all of that knowledge and information. It's fucking burned down, and for nothing. And that's just knowledge that we've lost. That's experience that we've lost, and we all lost it. I did, and you did, and we're never ever going to get it. We're never going to hear it. That's the Library of Alexandria, right? Everybody talks about the Library of Alexandria. Every elder that we lost to COVID, we lost the Library of Alexandria over and over again, because we can't recover it, and there's nothing we can do. Aside from the fact that most working people play, a dozen different roles in their lives outside of worker and consumer. A lot of them, volunteer, at shelters. They volunteer politically. They're a fellow churchgoer. They help with their local religious community. They help put on potlucks and things like that. They volunteer maybe at community theater. They're teaching our children how to act and sing and things like that. Maybe they teach piano and stuff like this on the side. Maybe they had horrible experiences in war that they've been able to salvage and turn into valuable life lessons that they're teaching to the children in their neighborhood. Maybe they're substitute teachers. Maybe they're teachers. Things like this. This is something that you cannot put on paper. This is a serious loss, and I'm still only talking about the one person, right? The one person, not the million people that we lost that it's going to hit inevitably. We're almost there now. And so this is the fact is that the ruling class has no understanding of the value of life, and the working class does. And we value each other. We value our lives. We value the lives of our family. We value the lives of our friends. And this is what's been exposed, right? And this exposure is historical because it shows, it really highlights, for forever, right? For 200 some odd years, forever, workers have been, screaming almost into the void about the ruthlessness of the ruling class, right? And the viciousness of the ruling class, or how oppressive and exploitative they are, and this and that. But really what this misunderstanding of the value of humanity, what this has exposed is the incompetence of the working class. And that's what's key for workers to take from this. The key is not to take how cruel the ruling class, the system can be. It's not to take how ruthless the system can be, how exploitative the system can be, because we've known that since it started. We knew that, our parents knew that, our grandparents knew that, our great-great-parents, our great-great-great-grandparents, our whole bloodline for the last 200 years has understood how cruel this system is. What's important for this generation to take from this experience is the incompetence. It's not just that they're cruel, it's that they're stupid. They are unremarkable people. They are not special. They're not as, most of these folks are not as intelligent as most of the people that anybody listening goes to work with on a day-to-day basis. They're not special, they're unremarkable, and they're incompetent. And, think about like me and you, Jules, right? Me and you and a dozen of your listeners are, on a fishing trip, and we wash up on a desert island, right? And the first thing that me, you, and your dozen listeners are going to do is say, okay, well, you 2-3 people, you go try to find materials so that we can build a shelter for everyone. You 2-3 people try to go find food. Do we have food? Do we have water? Go find that. And then the rest of us are going to build some type of distress signal, right? By the end of that night, okay, when night comes and the materials for building shelter have arrived, and we've built a shelter for all of ourselves, and the materials for food and have been gathered, and we're all sitting around in our shelter and we're eating together. In that 6, 7, 8 hours that we've been on that island, us, me, you, Rent, a labor leader, a podcaster, a producer, and podcast listeners, other workers. In that few hours, we have built a more humane system than the capitalists have been able to build in 200 years. Because it's been 200 years and they haven't figured out how to feed every child, how to make sure there's food on every table. And it's been 200 years and they haven't figured out how to make sure there's a roof over every head. We still have people dying on the side of the road from exposure, from freezing to death, from heat stroke and things like that. They haven't figured out how to do it. And it's not just through cruelty and exploitation, it's through incompetence. They don't know how to do it. If we gave them another 200 years, they wouldn't be able to do it. If we gave them 200 more years after that, if the planet's still around, they wouldn't be able to do it. No amount of time, no in 4-year increments will be able to, will they be able to figure out how to do this. We're the ones who know how to do it. We could figure it out in a second. That's why I say, give us the keys. Give working people the keys. And if after 200 years, we haven't built a system where every child is eaten and everybody's got a roof over their head and everybody's taken care of, they can have the keys back.
Yeah, very well said, brother. I will tell you, man, that I totally agree with you as far as the incompetence of the ruling class is concerned. And if you need evidence of the incompetence of the ruling class, look no further to someone like Elon Musk and his bright ideas. What's this bullshit about a hyperloop he's trying to build right now or something? Or that was his big idea. And it's like, bro, can we just get like public transportation going or something? We don't need this hyperloop shit. And, in an economic mode of production that places a primacy on the life and well-being of its citizens, i.e. like China, like they have what would be called something like a hyperloop with their high-speed rail trains and stuff like that going on already. I mean, we could have had that shit too, right? But again, it's the incompetence of the ruling class. And it's funny you give this analogy of like okay, so we crashed on the desert island with like 12 different people, and we all sort of mutually cooperate to build this. Some of us do build shelter, some of us find food, some of us make a distress signal. I think we're taught to believe, at least through maybe some common examples of literature and stories, that if the working class, crashed on a desert island or something, it would be kind of a Lord of the Flies situation, or it would be a war of all against all, like a Thomas Hobbes situation, or there would be one person that emerges as like superior that ruled and bossed the other people around or something, anything but this sort of communal, mutual aid, cooperation, anything but actually like the working class working together. So I think we're led to believe that, in a lot of ways that we're led to believe that we don't have as much in common with an everyday person as we might think. But in a lot of ways, we're taught to sort of fear that aspect of cooperation, or to fear, because, even throughout philosophy, I mean, I've studied some like Thomas Hobbes, and the Hobbesian notion is like that life is nasty, poor, brutish, and short. That in a state of nature, without civilization, we would be a war of all against all. And I think that, I don't, obviously that's not accurate, because you learn very quickly if you talk to your neighbors, if you talk to the people around you, you have much more in common with them than you do any sort of billionaire. I'll tell you the story that like, the way that I learned that I have more in common with a person that is homeless than anybody else, right? Like, billionaires, rich people, what have you, is that I did an unpaid internship in Nashville at Reba McEntire's studio. And this is a studio that's worth like $7 million. And they didn't pay me shit. For Christmas, they got me a $10 gas card to MAPCO. Right. So here I am and internships historically have been something that like, they kind of keep the rich kids in the good positions because they're the ones that can, that can afford to not be paid for months at a time, that can afford to subsist their housing and deal with these unpaid situations. I just had a dream, and we took out some student loans, and my family's working class. So I was there as a working class kid, 21 years old in Nashville, in a $7 million studio. And every day at the studio, they would have Panera bagels and they would have Krispy Kreme donuts, and it was my responsibility on my way into the damn place to pick this stuff up for the various session musicians and guests in this gaudy studio. And I would have to go pick up lunch for people and stuff too, but they're sending me out to these really expensive restaurants that like a kid that's not getting paid, I can't buy a $40 plate of pasta, and I have to get back very quickly. So I didn't really even have breaks. Like none of these rules of, you're allotted a lunch break and you get a 15-minute break here and there. And none of that stuff applied towards an unpaid internship. And I'll tell you that at the end of the night, after everyone had already eaten the bagels and had eaten their fill of donuts or what have you, that is what I lived off of. And so I would eat 3 or 4 of these bagels, maybe 5, and then I would put, a lot of bagels at the end of the day. I would throw them away, and it's what they wanted me to do, throw away these bagels. And so I'd have a big garbage bag full of bagels, and I'd go toss this out in a dumpster that was right outside the loading dock of Starstruck Studios. So one day, I throw this bag of bagels in there, and I hear a noise, and it's a person that's inside the dumpster. Now, this person I later learned was referred to as Dumpster Todd, because everybody in the studio knew of this person, yet nobody spoke to him. Nobody asked him how he was doing. Nobody offered him shit. And when I threw this bag of bagels in there and it hit him, I apologized. I was like, hey, I'm sorry. I didn't mean that to hit you, and he's like, are you the person that's throwing away these bagels? And I said, yeah. And he's like, well, man, if you wouldn't mind placing them to the side of the dumpster, I eat those. So I'd prefer them not be mixed in with everything else. If you want to leave them on the side of the dumpster, that'd be great. And I said, man, what's your name? He said, my name is Todd. I said, I'm Jules. And I said, Todd, I live off of these bagels too, man. And so I understand that. And I will sit these out on the loading dock every night for you as long as I'm here. And I became friends with Dumpster Todd at that point. And one day the guy he stopped coming around. So I don't know what happened to Todd. But that was in that moment, that's what taught me that not only do I have more in common with someone who is unhoused, someone who is severely restricted by poverty, someone who is oppressed, than I do with any member of the working class, than I did with any of the administrators upstairs in that building. And this is in a building where, like, the poverty is overcasted by the sheer amount of, like, I mean, that room to me, man, in that studio, it's if there was a doorknob, it was the most expensive doorknob they could find. You know, like they built a staircase and a balcony out of a specific tree that was the last wood from that tree that was available in the world. And that tree, they chose that wood and that material for its acoustic properties, and that's why they had. But we're dealing with, like, you know, they gave them $5 million to build both rooms. They went $1.5 million over budget, so it's almost a $7 million room in Nashville. And you know what? The thing is, though, man, as I look at Reba McEntire, and I'm like, remember that song "Fancy" that she did?
Yeah.
And it's like, wow, man. So you have people working for you for free that are, you know, that are feeding the homeless outside your studio. And you have the nerve to have a hit song called "Fancy" that talks about poverty and oppression and these sort of things. And, you know, I don't know, you take that anywhere you'd like, but I just, you know, in terms of, like, the example you gave with the Lord of the Flies situation and how we're taught to, like, how that would turn out to be a bad situation, how that would be non-cooperative and stuff like that. You know, it's just shameful, man, the way that we simply are not organized at this moment when we allow these things to occur within our society.
Yeah, that's right. And, you know, a lot of people made a whole lot of money off that song. Meanwhile, Fancy's eating out of a dumpster outside Starstruck Studios. You know, she actually, you know, Fancy from the song is eating out of a dumpster. Her mom's gathering the bagels and bringing them home for her. And that's, you know, the thing is that, you know, with art and anything else, they don't exist in a vacuum because the artists don't grow up in a vacuum, right? And so you have these things like Lord of the Flies, and you know, Thomas Hobbes and these other folks that you know try to sell this idea of human nature, right? And, like, that's the number one argument, you know, against cooperation, against you know, any sort of collective structure and things like that. And the number one argument people say is well, it's against human nature. But just the reality and the facts are against that. You know, we're social animals. You look at time after time, disaster scenario after disaster scenario, you know, whether it's a stalled cruise ship in the middle of the ocean, or it's an actual crash on a deserted island, or, you know, a plane might be about to go down, or there's a tornado coming through the town, or anything like that. Time after time after time after time, human beings come together and they help each other out. And it happens every single time. They help each other out. And, you know, it's interesting that so many folks will leave church Sunday afternoon after sitting in service, right? And they'll say, oh, that's against human nature. Working together is against human nature, right? When it's those 100 people that they just sat with, given the spare change out of their pocket, that keeps that church going. That church didn't exist. It wasn't there before, right? It wasn't there before that, you know, pastor has to get paid. You know, these other folks that put this together have to get paid. You have to pay for these materials. It costs money and resources to keep that service going, and the other services they might be offering to the community and this and that. And it comes from largely just everybody chipping in a little bit and volunteering their time, volunteering their labor how they can, and volunteering their resources how they can. So they're living the contrary view of human nature, right? They're living and experiencing what happens if, this is one service we've decided that we wanted. So we're giving a little bit of our time, a little bit of our labor, and we're giving a little bit of our money. And we've built this from nothing, right? And all it takes is taking that view and applying it to the whole world and saying, okay, you want to go to church on Sunday morning. You want this culture that's important to you, right? You get something out of that. That's important to you. It's important to your family. And so you give a little bit of time, a little bit of your labor, a little bit of your resources, and you build that poof out of nothing, right? All it takes is take that view and apply it to the whole world, apply it to your whole life, apply it to your whole existence, and say, what else do you want? What else do you want? Because working class folks sticking together and coming together can build anything else they want. Okay, if you want to build free healthcare, you can do it exactly the way you built that church. If you want free education, you can build it exactly the way you built that church. If you want roller coasters, if you want, damn near your whole life to be a life of leisure, and everything out of necessity is done through automation, and workers are provided for, through a national pension program and things like this, so they can live leisurely lives while the robots do all the work and stuff like that. Then you can build that the same way you built that church. It's that simple. It's that easy. And folks on the left, people in labor, people outside of labor, they God bless them. They read a whole lot of books, and they make things too complicated for themselves. And when they talk about it out loud, it's way too complicated than it needs to be. The reality is, working class folks are already building a socialist society. They're already doing it. They do it every Sunday. All it takes is to take that and apply it to the rest of your life.
That's awesome, man. Yeah, I mean, I really, you're so inspirational at times, brother. It's so I wonder. I want to go back to talking to you about your childhood. I know that you had a grandfather who was in the union. I think your dad worked in the trucking industry, and so I wonder if any of the the way that you find such inspiration in talking about the working class, was that infused into you at a young age by way of union participation of your family members, or where did that come from, man?
Yeah, so my family, they come from East Texas, far East Texas, and most of them, a lot of my grandparents, a lot of my cousins, my aunts and uncles, my father and whatnot. A lot of them, either for their whole lives or at some point, worked at a steel mill in Lone Star, Texas. It was called Lone Star Steel at the time, and now it was bought by U.S. Steel. But it was heavily unionized, organized by the United Steelworkers. There were regular, a very militant local. Because of the necessities. So this is a steel plant in the middle of the woods of East Texas. There, especially at the time, there really wasn't anything else. There was not really much industry, and the industry that did exist, retail, the food service, stuff like that, that existed because of the plant. It existed to support the plant and the plant workers and things like that. Right. So you have this very similar situation to a mine in Appalachia. Right. And so that was the work that was done. So when there was a strike, folks defended the picket line the way they would defend their family against an invader, right? And so it's very, very militant, almost militarized, local, and out of necessity. But yeah, so it was, a lot of how I came to where I came is out of that, coming from that kind of family. My father ended up working in the trucking industry. My mother, worked retail, her whole life. She still does. My father still works in the trucking industry, and things like that. I still have, cousins that work at the steel mill. Yeah, and so it was just seeing that and really seeing not only that, that type of, explicit union activity, but just really seeing the value of solidarity and the value of collective action in my day-to-day life, right? And when people needed something, it was always working class people who came together that made anything better. nobody in a $10,000 suit ever made anything any better for me or my family, and getting a knock on the door from someone with a nice car never meant anything good for my family. It always meant something bad was going to happen. Our life was going to change for the worse. But getting a knock on the door from a fellow worker meant that in all likelihood our lives were going to get a little bit easier and a little bit better. And so it was just really this basic idea. I didn't, I wasn't, 8 years old walking around reading Das Kapital or anything like that, and in fact, when I was 8, I was walking around, I was carrying the Bible, I was reading the Bible. The first remedy that I looked for was in religion. I thought, okay, yeah, things are really bad and things are bad for lots of folks. And, this is a message that can fix it. And so, until I was 11 or 12, most of my childhood, I wanted to be a preacher, and so, I read the Bible front and back, carried the Bible around, quoting, it's easier for a camel to walk through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get into heaven. This kind of stuff, as a small child, and to my teachers and get in trouble and, this kind of thing. But then it was, my experience with the organized religion, my analysis of, kind of the entire book, and things like that, they kind of turned me away from that. And it was, me, 10-year-old Kooper might have thought, okay, this is something that I can use to help folks. I'm not seeing the institutions actually doing that, especially where I was, like in Alabama, there was, a lot of hateful kind of rhetoric, stuff like that, particularly, towards like LGBT folks and things like that. And that wasn't something I was interested in. And so then I, started looking for other things, looking at different religions and going to different sorts of religious services and stuff like that. And I was 13, and I was at a mall in Houston, Texas. And a big mall, the biggest mall I ever seen in my life at the time. And just kind of walking around, couldn't really afford to get anything, but just kind of looking around and, taking the afternoon. And there was a kiosk in the mall, and it had a red and black Che Guevara t-shirt. And I saw it, and something about it, something about it like caught my eye, and I couldn't afford it, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. And so I got home, and my apartment complex, a lot of times I didn't have a computer or anything like that, but usually I lived like in an apartment complex where they had like one room that had like a computer that, folks could use. And so I went to that computer, and I wanted to find out more about that shirt. And something told me to Google the word Google image search the word revolutionary. Right. And then that same image popped up. And then, I looked into, how he came to his analysis and lived his life. And that's what led me eventually, transfixed me on the path that I ended up on.
So I know that and I have to ask you about this because you and I share that we both came up in Texas. I grew up in South Texas in the Rio Grande Valley. And so when I saw that you lived for a while in East Texas, I thought that that was really cool because I didn't know we had that in common. But I grew up in South Texas in a town that where if you don't really speak Spanish, it's a bit difficult to get by. In this small town known as Lyford, Texas, which is, if you can find that on a map, then great. It's in a little county called Willacy County, one county above the very tip of the bottom of Texas. And, and I bring this up because I know that you did some organizing around immigration issues when you were in high school. And I did want to ask you about that because it's very near and dear to my heart, working on behalf of immigrants, specifically immigrants that make their entrance across the border in Texas. I mean, growing up in South Texas, you end up sort of normalizing in your own head things that probably should probably stick out and have a little bit more cause for alarm. For instance, about if you go north of Lyford, Texas, about 10, 15 minutes north of Lyford, what happens is everything kind of disappears, and now you're driving through one of the largest areas of private land in the country, known as the King Ranch. And typically that is where migrants cross the Rio Grande, and then they make their way a little bit further north, and then they have to traverse this area of just untamed bush out there. It's like it's thorny, there's rattlesnakes, it's hot, and it's a dangerous 70 or 80 mile trip that they have to traverse. And if you are driving north out of that area of the country, out of that county, eventually, you will come to, in Sarita, Texas, you will come to a Border Patrol checkpoint. And that point is where they ask you, are you an American citizen? Where are you headed today? Where are you coming from? And they usually let you go. And, for most of the people that live in Texas around that area, it's not a big deal. Your car gets sniffed by dogs. You say hello to the Border Patrol agents, and then you're on your way. But this has been around for so many years that it's generationally sort of normalized of this is just what we do. We drive north and we go through the checkpoint and we say, hey, we're American citizens and da-da-da. But every time you make that drive up that way, there are buzzards that you can spot out, and what that is. That is an immigrant that crossed the border that did not make it successfully through the King Ranch. And I think that there was even a video of these Border Patrol agents that were at one point that were knocking over gallons of water that were left out there for immigrants. I believe that video was from the King Ranch, or if it wasn't, it was something that I could totally see happening in that area. And so how this applies to you, brother, is that I just wanted to ask you about some of the things you did in high school in terms of organizing when you found out that that Border Patrol agents were raiding the homes of some of the undocumented there. Because like I said, it's something that is near and dear to my heart. Most of my family are they're Mexican Americans. My grandfather was the first one on this border. My mother was the second generation on this border. And so I am third generation here, white passing, non-Spanish speaking. But God, dude, living in South Texas and understanding those things and knowing how sort of deeply rationalized those sites and actions and tragedies are. Tell us a little about what you did in high school on behalf of the immigrants in that area, brother.
Yeah, so I'll tell you this. The same thing I said about Jeff Bezos applies as well to Border Patrol and immigration agents who also have blood on their hands that murder folks and leave them in unmarked graves. That there's a thing that folks forget about the Trump concentration camps along the border is that several thousand children went missing from those concentration camps. Went missing, right? They're in the middle of a desert. They went missing, right? No, they didn't fucking go missing. That's another thing. What the buzzards are there for, right? That statistic are the buzzards. We know what the buzzards are there for, right? But it's normalized, and that's a little too. It would require so much action from us that it's a little too heavy to acknowledge. Sure. But those folks, all of those folks who have that blood of innocent workers on their hands will be held to account in our lifetimes. I'll say so. This is when I organized in high school. I was in that small East Texas area that my family had come from. I went to Mount Pleasant High School. And I was a sophomore, maybe a junior. So ICE was new. Immigration and Customs Enforcement was pretty new. Bush had started it after 9/11. It was pretty new at the time, and sort of the strategy of ICE under the Bush administration was to focus on towns and employers, right? Rather than, Trump made kind of a shift to focus along the border, start building these concentration camps and these sort of things. But the strategy initially under Bush was kind of these large scale military exercises focusing on major employers. And so they came to my area and set up this large, military camp. And what they did was for weeks would, first they raided the large chicken processing plant in town, one of the major employers. They raided a trailer manufacturer, and then they started going door to door. And there were, I had friends who showed up to school, went to school with me. And then when they went home, their parents were gone. And there was nothing, no notice, no nothing. You're just, you're there now and your parents aren't there. And that was rough. So, me and, a number of other folks decided, we wanted to do something about it. So we scheduled a series of actions. We had some protests, some, sign waving about it, said everybody at school wear red on May Day, in solidarity with immigrant workers, things like that. And eventually walked out. We ended up walking out and standing in the middle of downtown and saying, okay, we're not leaving. We're done. We're not leaving until they leave. We live here. They don't live here. So, we're not leaving until they leave. And then they left the next day. So we claimed we chased them out of town, this and that. If I'm being honest, they probably had a plan to leave the next day or whatnot. But the timing of everything did inspire the community, and the community did feel like we had stood together and we at least fought, and at least accomplished, something. Actions like that, something that Democrats and politicians and folks, something they can learn from organizers and from labor particularly, is that people don't really look at wins and losses the way people think, especially working folks. Working folks don't really look at wins and losses the way that politicians think we do. A Democrat will say, well, we just need to get a win. So if we need to water this shit down, and if we need to work and completely compromise our values and shake hands and be nice and stuff like that, and end up with some kind of bill that doesn't actually help anybody, but it looks nice, then that's a win, and that's what our people care about. That's completely wrong. Any kind of organizer will tell you that a lot of times people don't expect you to win. They just want to see you fight. And they just want to see somebody fight, and, any labor rep listening will understand that, deeply, that, that workers don't expect you to win every grievance. They don't expect you to win every little contract proposal that they develop before going into the negotiations. They don't expect you to win everything. All they want to do, they want to see their guys fight for them. They want to see their people, fighting for them and for their fellow workers. And sometimes that's enough. And so, that's where we came out. But that was my experience. It continued. When I moved to Dallas after high school, I continued organizing along protesting deportations, organizing community programs against violence against immigrant women, and some of these serve the people kind of community programs and stuff like that in Dallas, and have built some good immigrant worker institutions in South Dakota as well. And that's something that is near and dear to my heart as well. Being Indigenous, we didn't draw that line. We didn't draw the American-Mexican border, right? And the reality is that's a militarized border. But working folks cross borders our whole lives. That's all we do. When we can go back to, when we first started the discussion, how many borders did I say that I crossed as a child, that my family had to cross looking for work? The jobs would dry up and my family would have to cross borders to find work, and other working people are the same way. The difference is that, one's militarized, one's not. The bosses say that one side is our enemy or something like that, and the others, they don't. It's like when I look at a lot of that, when I look at the immigration policy of this country, particularly with like the foreign policy in general of the country and their dealings with other countries and other people around the world, it comes to mind when Nelson Mandela first got out of jail, and people forget that this government treated Nelson Mandela like a terrorist for his whole life. But when Nelson Mandela got out of jail, he was kind of on tour in this country and whatnot. And he went on this, talk show, and some American asked him a question, how can you say you're, for these values when your friends, you say Fidel Castro is a great man, you're friends with Castro, you're friends with Gaddafi, you're friends with these people and stuff like that. And Mandela said, this is very simple. Your enemies are not mine. Your enemies are not our enemies. And, we have our own friends and we have our own enemies. And that exact same thing is true of the working class of this country. Our enemies are not the enemies that the bosses say. Our enemies are not our bosses' enemies. If you hear on CNN, China's our enemy. So-and-so, like Cuba's our enemy. Vietnam is our enemy. Laos is our enemy. These are the places. These are our enemies. Those are the bosses' enemies, right? Those are the bosses' enemies. This is between the class in charge of this country and the class in charge of those countries. The conflict is between that. But it's not between us. Working folks around the world are not our enemies. Those are our friends. And if we come to realize that and come to that understanding, and seeing ourselves as a global working class involved in a global structure against common enemies, then we'll be much better off.
Yeah, man. So I want to ask you about what's going on in South Dakota, because I know that when COVID broke out, I think all eyes for a bit were on South Dakota. With the meat processing plants and the labor things that were happening there that were. And this has to do with immigration as well. Just as I know there were a lot of undocumented workers in the Smithfield plants and a lot of COVID outbreaks. And so since we have you here and since you are the South Dakota president of the Labor Federation there, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about this stuff, man. But can you maybe set the stage and refresh listeners' memories as to what all went down and perhaps where that stands as of today?
Yeah, sure. So one of the largest employers in South Dakota, particularly the largest union employer, is the Smithfield Foods Pork Processing Plants in Sioux Falls. And the workers there are largely immigrant and refugee, mostly from the African continent, but also from Asia, Southeast Asia, and South America. And so they were in a unique position. The workers there were in a unique position to see COVID coming because they were getting reports and hearing stories from their home countries of how COVID was impacting those countries, Southeast Asia, Africa, South America, places like this. So they were in the alarm pretty quickly. That this is serious pretty quickly, and at the beginning of the year, this is serious. We need to make these changes. We need social distancing. We need sanitizer. We need temp checks. We need dividers. We need all these things. But like any company, the bosses weren't getting their advice from their workers. They were looking for advice from the governor and from the president, Donald Trump and Governor Christie Noem. And largely they were saying it's not a big deal. doesn't matter, things like this. And so they didn't implement any changes. Fast forward a few months, and the Smithfield plant in Sioux Falls becomes the #1 COVID outbreak hotspot in the United States. The shocking thing about that position on that list is that it was the only civilian workplace that was on the list. Everything else on that list, #2, #3, #4, #5, they were prisons. They were prisons, county jails, and there was like one aircraft carrier in the middle of the ocean that was on the list. Everything else was prisons. And Smithfield was the only civilian workplace. Absolutely. Anything for Jules and Matt. Voluntarily. And it was the #1 hotspot. So several thousand workers ended up testing positive. Several workers died and will never come back. And the union fought tooth and nail. It was like pulling teeth. We were able to get the plant to shut down for cleaning for 3 days, but then it turned out the plant told everyone they were shutting down for cleaning for 3 days, but still maintained it at 60% capacity. Still had a bunch of workers coming in, and we had to be the ones to talk to the mayor and talk to other folks and say, yeah, you think they're shut down? They're not shut down. We know, because the people are telling us they're coming in. We know who's going in, and things like that. And we were finally able to get it shut down for a longer period of time. Have OSHA and the Department of Health and other folks, come in, and they eventually ended up making the changes that the workers had recommended at the beginning of the year after all of this had already happened. And so this is an example. This is the desert island example, right? The workers saw it coming. The workers knew what they needed to do, were prepared to do it, and the boss just put money first. And a lot of that, through this whole time, they're also being called essential workers. They're being told this and that, and dealing with the same kind of treatment. Fast forward to earlier this year, the contract negotiations are up. The union is involved in negotiating. And after all of that, after all that they had been through, the bosses came to the table with a stack of concessions, asking them to giving them fewer breaks, proposing not giving them significant pay increases, and making it to where they couldn't even take unpaid leave, which a lot of them take to go visit their home countries and things like this, limiting things that didn't even cost them anything, but just limiting things. And there was a question of, at least in the Sioux Falls labor movement, there was a question of what are they thinking? How can they look at the year that workers have had and come to the table with concessions? And the clear answer is that it's not clear, because workers have good hearts, right? But the clear answer is that the bosses saw themselves as the victims. It wasn't the workers. It was the bosses. The bosses had to deal with all these regulations. The bosses had to pay to change all these things. The bosses lost, this amount of profit and stuff like this. So they came to the table thinking they were the victims of the situation, because they maybe their profits went down 1% or 2%. Maybe they had to deal with some of these difficult regulations and make these changes and stuff like that. So they're the victims. So they need to take steps forward. Instead of giving the workers what they want. And it shows the incompetence, and it shows the disconnect in values and norms. So the workers voted 99% to reject the boss's contract offer. They turned around and took a strike vote. 98% voted to authorize the strike. It was a great turnout. And shortly after that, within 10 days, they had a new agreement with raises, without concessions, with historic raises and things like this. The workers came together and decided, okay, you want to enforce this? We're about to walk. And, the bosses caved, as they do.
Man, well, that's great to hear about that victory, man. And, it's just, it's just shocking, no matter how many times I encounter it, that like somehow the managerial class and bosses seem to always posture as victims themselves, you know? And it goes back to your original point of like ultimately their morals and values function off of a sort of calculation, a sort of utilitarian in the name of profits sort of thing. And, you know, after a year of what's happened with I mean, I remember at the time when like even like someone like Rachel Maddow was talking about the Smithfield outbreak, and it was just horrific sounding. I mean, at that point, within the sort of greater traumatic timeline of COVID, the American public was really like on the edge of their seat in terms of like fear, anxiety, panic, and not knowing what to do, needing some sort of leadership to the point where even people across the nation latched on to fucking Andrew Cuomo as like as a sort of leader of this entire process, right? And so, but the fact that like, you know, people are dying and they've lost employees, and it was Christ, man, like the only civilian employment center. I mean, that is, with the rest of them being prisons. I mean, it reminds me of like, you know, on Working People, Max spoke with Sherry Renfro about the Frito-Lay strike, and she had mentioned about how at the Frito-Lay factory they have visitation rooms, whereas it's like the only other facility that has visitation rooms, scare quotes, are prisons, you know? So, yeah, all of this is shocking that you add all this together and the bosses at the end of the day still come with a list of concessions and still see themselves as the victims. And it takes the threat of withholding labor to actually get them to do what needs to be done, which is like, and the things they're restricting, like you mentioned, aren't even things that cost them anything. You know, it's like, why would you even restrict the items that don't cost your company anything? So yeah, it's wild. I'm really happy they got that victory, and they have, like I said, historic raises. I think that's really wonderful, but it's tragic that it takes, you know, people dying and a COVID, raising to the level of the number one COVID hotspot in the country. It takes all of this to get to a point where the threat of withholding your labor has to happen, and that's the only vehicle to actually getting the results that these workers need and deserve.
Yeah, and it's just a reminder that we're never gonna our conflict with these folks. It's not reconcilable. You know, we're never gonna be able to reconcile. No matter what the facts are, no matter what the material conditions are, they're always gonna posture themselves as if we're doing wrong to them, and that's just the reality of being in an abusive relationship. And if we want to break it all the way down to an abusive marriage, you know, the abuser is always the victim, right? In the discussion, you know, they're always the one who's the victim. Why are you doing this to me? Why are you making me do this? You know, and the stuff like this. You know, they're always the victim to justify their abuse, right? So they victimize themselves. They cry victimhood in order to justify their abuse, and that's what the bosses will always, always, always do. They're never ever going to provide working people what we need. They're never going to treat us fairly as a class. You know, they're never, ever going to do any of these things. And we're never going to get what we need and live the kind of lives we can live with them in charge. And it's the very simple concept is, let's just get rid of them. And you know, you look at like the economic threats, right? And so the economic threat to working folks, the worst thing that could happen to me and you is that we can starve to death and freeze to death under a bridge somewhere, die destitute. The worst thing that can happen to a boss is that they eventually become a worker. Those are different threat. That's what they're being faced with. You know, oh, if you lose your business, okay, you got to go to work with the rest of us. And you know, so the reality is, and that's why I keep pushing within the labor movement and outside of the labor movement and everywhere, that, you know, the reality is that we can change whatever policy we want to, and that will provide some small wins, and it'll help people feel better and give people a little bit better lives, right? But we have to look at policy the way the Black Panthers looked at community programs, right? And so the Black Panthers weren't just an organization that wanted to feed free breakfast to children. They wanted to give free education to children. They wanted to put up free medical clinics and stuff like that. They weren't just an organization that just wanted to provide that sort of philanthropic, or community organizing sort of thing. They wanted to usher in a whole new order. They wanted a revolution, but they understood that certain things needed to happen in order for the people to be in a material place to successfully win a struggle like that. And so what they said about their community programs was survival pending revolution. And we have to look at these policies and contract fights like that, like survival pending revolution, because there's no future for the working class under this kind of system, but there can be survival. So it has to be survival pending a revolution, because we have to get rid of the system. We have to make sure working class people are in charge of the political and economic system, and we have to survive in order to do that. But being stuck on having our entire political programs, all of our legislative efforts and all this stuff focused on this policy, that policy, or that policy, we're leading our people. We're being, what Fred Hampton said of the Weather Underground. We're being custoristic. We're leading our people in a position where they can be massacred, and they are massacred year after year after year. And we can't do that. We have to work towards progressive policy that can offer some relief to our people, but it has to be in the larger context of a revolutionary struggle where we get rid of these systems altogether. We need to move away from policy and talk about power.
Yeah, man. And one last thing before we conclude or wrap up, I just want to say that this conversation is kind of added to this reoccurring thought that I've had, and I've been calling this train of thought, or this thread of thoughts I've been having, I've been calling it capital R rehumanization. And what I mean by that is that when people look at a railroad, they understand a railroad stretches for miles, right? When they look at a skyscraper, they understand a skyscraper has multiple floors, it scrapes the sky, what have you, right? But what we don't typically see when we look at these marvels of engineering or construction or what have you, we don't see the human toll that these infrastructures and buildings, like the human cost of these things. So we don't think about the number of people that died in the construction of the railroad. We don't think of the worker accidents that happened during the construction of skyscrapers, right? And, maybe we can historically situate it as like James Baldwin says when he's like, I built the railroads and I built the docks, in that great, the speech that he did when he debated William F. Buckley. You guys can find that on YouTube. It's this old black and white video, which is just amazing to see that, Buckley only has like one counterpoint at the end, and it's not even really a point. But going back to this capital R rehumanization thing, I will say that, like, when workers are injured, I keep going back to like the Nate Holdren book called Injury Impoverished. He had the story of a worker named Nettie Blom. And Nettie Blom was a woman who worked at the Yellowstone. She worked at Yellowstone National Park in a linen pressing factory. And at one point, her hand became trapped inside of a steamer, which was basically like this cylindrical piece of hot metal that just pressed linen as it goes into this machine. And her arm was caught, and her arm was mangled, and she ended up not really receiving very much compensation out of that entire tragic accident. But how this relates to, rehumanization of, and part of the reason why I love Max's podcast is because he talks about the childhood and the happenings and the way that, like, every worker, they have something like a little sister who they don't like because she chews with her mouth open. All these little things that add to their humanity, right? So Nettie Blom, in her injury at Yellowstone, the way we even talk about injuries, that she lost an arm. Well, it's like that arm what is that arm? It's a limb, it's 5 fingers, it's a hand, but even in the way that we talk about her loss, it is detached from her person. It is detached from the human toll. It's not just the injury of losing something to a workplace accident, but it's like, it's the guitar that you can't play anymore. It's the piano that you can no longer play. It's learning how to ride again. It's living with the shame of an accident. It is proceeding through the rest of your life with intrusive thoughts about perhaps being unlovable because of the nature of your accident. All of these things that go into the actual human toll of these, these wages that working people pay back to the ruling class by way of workplace injuries and disregard for personal safety, and these sort of at best replaceable and in many ways disposable way that the working class is regarded in the minds of the bourgeoisie and the ruling class. So I wonder if you, before we go, would you say a few words about maybe some steps we could take to sort of rehumanize the working class, to be seen as more than just laborers, to be seen in our full humanity as people who are, living, breathing, thinking, desiring, fully human types of we're just, we're fucking fully human, man. And there is a tendency within conversations about labor to sort of forget that aspect. So I wonder if you might say a few words on like rehumanization, brother.
Yeah. So you're spot on, and a core value of the work we do here, a core principle is the understanding that workers are whole human beings, right? And that's what we say over and over again. Workers are whole human beings, and that is our response to. It's a counter response to the kind of cynical idea of kitchen table issues. It's a response to this cynical idea that if you're organizing workers or anything like this, then social issues are divisive and distract people from economic issues and things like that. And so what we say to counter that is that no, workers are whole human beings. And what you are trying to do is break up workers into little pieces and then address each piece that you're comfortable addressing at the time, or that is advantageous for you to address at the time, while ignoring every other part of that work. The reality is that workers have economic needs as well as they have social needs. Workers are whole human beings, and they have a whole set of needs and a whole set of experiences and things like that. So that's the foundation of our political program. And so to me, it makes as much sense to say that social issues addressing a worker's social needs is a distraction from addressing their economic needs. It's the same thing as if somebody tried to tell me that okay, if you're going to negotiate for high wages, you're going to distract from negotiating for good health care. It doesn't make sense. It does not distract. You're addressing multiple needs, and that's something that has to happen. Every human being has multiple needs, a whole set of needs. They're a whole human being, and all of those needs need to be met. And you have to fight for them. If you don't want to, if you don't have the wherewithal to fight for workers' social needs as well as their economic needs, then resign. Step down and make room for people who will. But the reality is that the labor movement isn't just this idea that the labor movement is a representative of people who have union cards in their back pocket, and it represents those people from the time they clock in until the time they clock out, or if they have an issue that happened during the periods when they were clocked in and clocked out. That is not what the labor movement is. The labor movement has been around on this earth as long as exploitation has been around. As long from the first time, if you like Google the labor movement. They'll say, oh, labor movement started with the Industrial Revolution and started with the amalgamated, so-and-so stonemasons, whatever, this and that. But what I say, and what a lot of labor folks my age and younger say, is that the labor movement started the day that one man was forced to serve another in order to survive. The labor movement was born there. And with that, with that spirit, what we say is Moses was a labor organizer. Nat Turner was a labor organizer. Denmark Vesey was a labor organizer. The struggle to abolish chattel slavery is a labor struggle. And that's why a lot of folks who adopt that view and that definition of the labor movement, that is why we're also the ones who say that sex workers must be included in the labor movement, that incarcerated workers must be included in the labor movement because they're heavily exploited. Now, if you're too afraid to get into the prisons and organize the most exploited workers, if you're too afraid to go into the dark crevices of capitalist society and organize the most heavily exploited and oppressed people, then just say that. Just say you're scared. Say you're too scared and never run for a labor office again. But now is the time where we need people of conviction, and we need people of courage, and we need people of imagination. And the labor movement is full of those people, and they're ready to lead the working class of this country and around the world through a struggle that will abolish every system of exploitation that the world has ever seen and build up new political and economic systems based on our values, the values of life and the values of solidarity and the values of justice. We're prepared to do that. We have the tools to do that. We have the numbers to do that. All it takes is the will.
Awesome. Cooper, where can we find you online, brother?
You can follow me on Twitter at Kooper Caraway, Kooper with a K, KOOPERCARAWAY.
All right, Cooper, thanks so much for hanging out with us today. I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope in the future we can bring you back for, you might be a great person to bring in someone I've been thinking about of doing a series of shows of something like how to unionize your workplace. As I know there's a lot of talk of obviously, the labor movement is sort of making some waves right now, and Starbucks just got a union. There's been Amazon, union drives in Bessemer, Alabama, and so I'm sure there's a lot of listeners out there that are curious as to how they could go about possibly unionizing their workforce and their places of work. And it's something that I'm not exactly sure how to go about that myself, but I'm sure that a person like you could provide some insight, and so. Perhaps we can have that in the future.
Absolutely. Anything for Jules and Matt.